Hello everyone, it's Marc Sabatella from Mastering MuseScore. How y'all doing? This is the MuseScore Café, and this is Wednesday, and I want to say the date, April 12th, and this is my weekly series where we talk about some aspect of making music using MuseScore. So usually I have a particular topic to talk about, and that's the case today. We're going to be talking mostly about multiple voices. We'll talk about, whatever else comes up along the way, but my focus is going to be talking about multiple voices, which is the term, the kind of standard musical term for having more than one independent line, more than one independent melodic line, more than one independent rhythm on the same staff. And it's one of these things where it's funny in that when you first learn to read music, it's usually never really talked about, and a lot of people sort of never have a good, clear sense of what this is about. And then you might read some piano music and see it and sort of instinctively figure out what it means without really dealing with it. So yeah, we're going to demystify the concept a little bit and then talk about how we're actually going to work with it in MuseScore. So my question for you, I did do some tests before. Sound seemed to be okay. I had to do some fiddling, but I think you should have been able to hear the music, and you should be hearing me. And if I blow gently into the microphone, you should hear that gentle blowing. So let me know if those things are true. So, my first, order of business here is I want to talk a little bit about, where multiple voices are actually used. So in my score that we were just listening to in MuseScore Café, normally if you're just looking at a trumpet part, you're not going to see multiple voices. If you're just looking at a saxophone part, you're not going to see multiple voices. Trombone, you're not going to see multiple voices. In guitar music, you might. In piano music, you might. But in point of fact, in this particular piece, we don't. In this particular piece, I don't think I use multiple voices anywhere in the piano or guitar parts. However, or the bass part for that matter, where you wouldn't normally expect to see them. But they're all over the drum part. So let's just focus on the drum part for a minute here. If we look, and let me just look at the drum part here. Let's take a look at the drums. Okay, so first of all, you hear that bass drum there. Let me make sure the volume's back where I want it. The bass drum are these down stem notes, and the bass drum on this particular arrangement just continues through every beat throughout most of the piece. Bass drum, right? And then bass drum continues playing quarter notes while the cymbal and snare do other things, right? So there's multiple rhythms being shown at the same time on this drum part. And this is very typical to the point of being almost universal for drum set music. And there's different ways that we do this because, you got four limbs, right? You got two arms, two legs that you could be playing drums with. And in principle, you could have four independent rhythms. But because of the special nature of drums where you can't really tell the difference between a quarter note and an eighth note, there's some simplifications we can talk about if we get into that later, where for drums you can sometimes simplify rhythms to use fewer voices. So even though you might have four kind of independent things going on, you might be able to kind of cheat things. Like for instance, well, let's talk about it. This snare hit is on 2 and 4. Really, if I were just talking about a snare hit on 2 and 4, I would have notated that with quarter notes. I would have called it a quarter note and said, the bass drum is quarter notes on every beat, the snare drum is quarter notes on 2 and 4. And I would have notated that. But then I would have needed, in order to be able to show this ride cymbal, the bell of the ride cymbal is why you see that funny note head. If I wanted to notate that on the off beats, I would have needed a third voice. I would have needed one voice to say quarter notes on the beat, a second voice to say quarter rest, quarter note, quarter rest, quarter note for the snare, and a third voice to say eighth rest, eighth note, eighth rest, eighth note, eighth rest, eighth note for the ride cymbal. But because in percussion, again, there's not really a reason that that snare had to be notated as a quarter note. By cheating it and calling it an eighth note, I'm able to combine it with the ride cymbal like that and have have it be an eighth note. And so that way, instead of there being an eighth rest for the ride cymbal, I'm putting the snare drum note there. This particular way I am combining things is very commonly done for drums. It's one common way of notating things where we basically take things that we do with our hands, most of the cymbals other than hi-hat and most of the drums other than bass drum, things that we do with our hands we do in voice 1, stems up. Things we do with our feet, which is bass drum and hi-hat, we do in voice 2, stems down. That is one common way of notating drums. It's not the only way, but it's the way MuseScore does things by default. You can set it up to do it differently. Like some people prefer to put the snare with the bass drum, and that's okay too. MuseScore lets you do that. I don't want to dwell too much on the intricacies of drum notation, but I want to point out that reading multiple voices is absolutely fundamental to how drummers read music when they read music. There's going to be multiple voices, whether it's hands up, feet down, or whether it's cymbals up, drums down, or however you might want to notate it. You're going to generally have multiple voices. What I want to do now is flip over to a piano score. And this is, actually, let me flip to some Bach. So this is a Bach score here. And in this piece here, we can see, let me just make this chat a little narrower. Y'all can feel free to continue commenting in here, and hopefully I'll see things as they go by. But this is from my counterpoint course. It's a Bach fugue, and it's got multiple rhythms going on. So I'm going to play a bit of this, and let's talk about what the voices are for, and then I'll talk about entering them. So far, we've only needed one voice per staff. One voice on the top staff, one voice on the bottom staff. But right where I stopped, a third voice enters. So when I talk about voice, it's important to realize I've been using the term voice, and we haven't heard anyone sing yet, right? When we talk about voices in music, we are not necessarily talking about singing. However, the term does derive from vocal music, which was, originally the only kind of music anyone ever tried to notate. So yeah, let's start here and pay attention to what's going on. So what happens here, and actually I'm gonna undo something that I had done before. There's a setting you might want to know about in MuseScore, Edit, Preferences, and then under Canvas, there's this setting here to limit scroll area to page borders. I had turned that on earlier, and this is the same setting in MuseScore 3 and MuseScore 4, subtle differences in how it works. But what it means is it's going to allow me to move the score off to the side more freely. So with that setting, I can't do this. I can't move the music all the way to the side, but with that setting disabled, I can move the music to the side, and that's going to be a little more useful while I'm watching the chat here. So what's going on in these measures here is the right hand just has do da 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 dum, and then dum, right? That note, bum bum. That voice has quarter note, half note, but another voice has ba da 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 dum, has another rhythm at the same time. So while the top voice is sustaining the quarter note and half note, that bottom voice is doing this other moving line. And I say bottom voice, I mean bottom voice for that staff. That's actually the middle voice, right? Because the true bottom voice is in the bottom staff here. So here I want to make a distinction between voices in the MuseScore sense and voices in the contrapuntal sense. This piece is for 3 voices, so I'll say there's a top voice, a middle voice, and a bottom voice. But when we talk about MuseScore, we're just going to number the voices per staff, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So this is voice 1, the top voice of this staff. This is voice 2, the bottom voice of this staff. So when I'm using the term voice and talking about top, bottom, number, if it seems ever confusing, feel free to call me on it, but realize that there is that distinction. So I'm referring to this as the bottom voice here. It's voice 2 of the top staff, but it's not. It's really the middle voice as far as the overall arrangement is concerned. So I'm spending this time talking about what multiple voices are and how they're used and why they exist, because that's important background information before you can start using them effectively. If you start randomly pressing buttons and clicking things and typing things without a clear concept of why you're doing it, you're likely to get yourself into trouble. So I want to make sure that we're clear on what we're doing. So another thing to be aware of in this piece is that this middle voice doesn't necessarily always live on the top staff. Like this particular fugue has 3 voices. The middle voice will sometimes be notated on the top staff. But if it starts playing lower notes, like later here, it moves to the bottom staff. See here, this is still the middle voice. And you can tell it's the middle voice, right? Because we got our top voice here. We got our bottom voice here. This is the middle voice. There's only 3 voices in this fugue, as far as I remember, right? It is a voice, pretty sure it's a 3-voice fugue. I don't think a 4th voice enters, except maybe sometimes at the very, 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 very end. There might be 4 or more voices, like for the last measure. That's a common Bach trick. Yeah, I had found this one spot here where the top voice is that F, the bottom voice is this D, and they're on separate staves, but the middle voice started doing some notes that are low enough, and more important than how low they are, they are closer to the bottom voice in that there's no way I could play this D with the same hand that I play that F. That's a 10th. I can't reach that. I could barely reach it, but I would not be able to make that moving line happen. So I have no choice but to play that middle voice with the left hand in this portion right here. There's no way to play that middle voice other than with the left hand. Whereas other places, it's maybe the other way around. There's no way to play this A other than with the right hand, because it goes with that D, not with that F. So is it possible to play only the middle voice, is Dave's question. And so Dave, this is a great, great question, and it's a sort of a pet peeve of mine in terms of how people often put these things together, and it's understandable. But what I would say here is I don't remember if when I entered this, I did not enter this piece from scratch. I took this piece from MuseScore.com, where it had been done as part of the OpenScore project many years ago, but I did make a number of sort of adjustments to it in some of my examples. But what I would say is, ideally, I would have entered this, if I were doing it myself, I would have entered this note as being on the top staff, but using cross-staff notation. If so, then it's going to be possible to isolate it. So let's check this out. This E here is voice 2, and if you look down at the status bar, you can see it says voice 2, staff 1. So that rest is voice 2, staff 1. This E, the next note, is also voice 2, staff 1. Now I'll hit the right arrow. Aha, see that D down here? It's on the bottom staff visually, but the status bar tells us it's voice 2, staff 1. If you use cross-staff notation, so that you're entering the note on one staff but making it appear on the other, then you can have the kind of coherence to that line that you would need in order to do what Dave is asking about. So let's talk about that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say select all. I've selected everything in the entire score. And now I'm going to come over to the Properties panel, and I'm going to turn off playback. So now when I play it, I'm not going to hear anything, right? I don't hear diddly. But I'm now going to right-click this note and say select similar. Oops, not similar, sorry. Right-click that note, select more, same voice. Now only the voice 2 notes are selected, and I can therefore turn on their playback. And now I'm going to hear just that middle voice. I think I actually have my voices. Oh, yeah, see, and that, okay, so that's the thing. Here, this passage here, I am doing what I would want to do of using cross-staff notation, but this C sharp here, whoever entered this didn't do that thing. They actually said, well, I'm starting a new measure. I'm just going to let that middle voice live in the bottom staff. See that it's blue when I highlight it and I go down to the status bar, it says voice 1, staff 2. So unfortunately, they weren't consistent. The person who entered this used cross-staff notation in some places to have that middle voice stay on the same staff, but they weren't consistent about it. And I said this is a pet peeve for me for a number of reasons, but one of them is accessibility. If I am, and it's not just accessibility, but if I'm trying to enter this voice using keyboard shortcuts, which I'm going to show you in a few moments, I just want to keep entering that middle voice, as you know, and I don't want to have to keep switching which staff I'm entering notes on and which voice I'm using. I just want to enter that middle voice in one long stream, and then I can decide which staff I want it to live on. So from an ease of entry perspective, I like that. But from an accessibility perspective, it's really good because then someone who is relying on a screen reader to read the score for them, and they're navigating it one note at a time, it's going to be quite confusing if they're navigating here and then suddenly it takes them totally to some other measure because that was like the next time when voice 2 was used in that staff. So it is a bit of a pet peeve of mine when these wandering voices don't stay consistent. And that's one reason I actually wanted to show the Bach example here, because I knew that it was likely that happened, and I did want to show that to you. When I do music on my own, even when it wanders between staves, I'm looking to see if my bottom voice, if my middle voice in my fugue here ever wanders to the bottom staff, and it does over here. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, maybe not. Yeah, in any case, I like to be consistent about that. So it does make life sometimes a little more complicated as far as having to manage the cross-staff notation, but I'll show you that too. So I said I'm going to show you things. All right, now that we've talked about why these things exist, let's go ahead and do it. Actually, I have to show you one other thing first, because since I mentioned voices and that this all comes from vocal music, well then of course I should be showing you some vocal music where this happens, and this is the classic example. When you're writing for 4 voices on 2 staves, then you're going to put the soprano part stems up in voice 1, the alto part stems down in voice 2, so that you can keep the parts separate. Now sometimes we will combine them into one voice where the rhythms happen to line up, but other places like this measure here, where the soprano has ba-da-da-dum, and the bottom voice, the alto voice, has da-da-da-dum. It's 2 different rhythms at the same time. There's no way to do that without multiple voices. So we're going to need multiple voices very often in doing this type of choral music. SATB, 4 voices but only 2 staves. So we're going to want voice 1 for the soprano, voice 2 for the alto, and then, common mistake that I mentioned in the newsletter this week, on the bottom staff, again we're going to go back to voice 1 for the tenor, voice 2 for the bass. Don't use voice 3 for the tenor. It's one of the most common MuseScore mistakes there is to think that the tenor is the third voice musically, therefore we should use voice 3 in MuseScore, but don't, because then you're going to end up with rests in voice 1 that you don't want, and generally MuseScore's layout algorithms, everything about how it's designed to work, expects that voice 1 is going to be used first on every staff. So every staff start with voice 1. All right, so now let's talk about entering this business here. So I'm going to enter some notes here, and when I do this, they're going to be in voice 1 because I'm not telling it anything else. When you enter notes, normally they are entered into voice 1 by default. And yes, Dave, I will show cross-staff notation here. So I've entered those notes in voice 1. If I now want to enter notes into voice 2, usually what I'll do is I'll enter a few measures at a time, and then I'll go back in voice 1, and then I'll go back and get voice 2. I'll do whatever makes sense to me musically. Sometimes only one measure, sometimes 2, sometimes 4, sometimes 8, whatever seems to make sense musically. Here I've entered 2 measures. What I want to do now is move back to the beginning. So I'm going to hit Control left, which would be Command left on a Mac, and that moves me back 1 measure, Command left again. Notice I'm still in note input mode. There's another common mistake that people make is not staying in note input mode when you change voices. It's very important that you are in note input mode when you change voices. I'll show you what happens otherwise in a minute. But now I'm going to use the voice 2 button on the toolbar here. And there's a shortcut, Control Alt 2 or Command Alt 2. So when I press this, notice that the cursor is currently blue, but when I press the voice 2 button, now the cursor is green. So now when I enter notes, they are going to be in voice 2. So I'm going to enter some quarter notes in voice 2, E, not that octave, so Control down, and then D, C, B, C. All right, I've just entered some notes into voice 2. And notice they have stems down, and the voice 1 notes went stem up, right? Notice that voice 1, when there was only voice 1, like in the second measure here, there's only voice 1, these stems are down, which is normal because if there's only one voice, then we take notes on the top half of the staff and have their stems. The stems always point to the middle of the staff when there's only one voice. But as soon as I entered that next note, as soon as I entered a C, MuseScore says, there's 2 voices here, I need to flip the stems around. And so now voice 1 stems will go up, voice 2 stems down. So if there's only one voice in a measure, MuseScore will point the stems according to how high or low the note is. But as soon as you have 2 voices in a measure, the stems automatically flip so that voice 1 is up, voice 2 is down. And Shayana, or however I say your name, yeah, that pet peeve of having the middle voice, it's a natural thing, and yeah, I'd probably do it too. It's sometimes easier to enter, but I do find overall it makes my life simpler to manage later and especially because I'm often producing educational materials for blind musicians, or that could potentially be consumed by blind musicians. I try to be cognizant of how confusing it can be. Like, actually, let me flip over to that, because now I'm about to do the cross-staff notation thing here, but let me flip back over to the Bach example. When we look at that Bach example, that's not Bach, that's me. Here's Bach. When we look at that example, here is that middle voice going to the E and then moving down to a D. That's reasonably obvious to look at it. We can make it more obvious if I select both of those notes and then say add lines, note anchored line. And now it's made more visually obvious that that line is moving from the top staff down to the bottom. So there's things like that that we can do to make it more visually obvious when things move around like that, but it's usually obvious enough even without those lines. But if you're relying on keyboard shortcuts and a screen reader to read that middle line for you, those visual cues aren't going to help you. The screen reader is just going to tell you, it is not going to see these notes as being related in any way unless you actually use the cross staff notation feature. So let's talk now about the cross staff notation. Let me go back to my example here. In this example, if I were to try to play this on the piano, I can play C and E in the same hand. I can play D and D in the same hand. But I can't play E and C in the same hand. So really, I would want this note, this middle C, to be in the left hand. So to move it to the bottom staff, you can either do this in note input mode or in normal mode. It's going to be Control Shift down. That will move the note to the bottom staff. And when I do that, it's going to keep its stem direction. You know, you might have to manually adjust stems, or you might have to manually adjust some offsets also. And I'll show how that could happen in a moment as well if that comes up. But this idea, so you can also then select multiple notes at the same time and Control Shift down them both together. So that is how you would enter the notes. So you enter the notes onto one staff, then Control Shift down. Now I'm a big keyboard shortcut person, but if you can't remember that, there is a toolbar button for it as well. Let me select these notes and let's come over to the toolbar. It's not there by default, but if I press my add button, oh, not the add button, sorry, the gear icon on the toolbar, scroll down a bit, I will eventually find the cross staff beaming button, and I will enable that. And now the cross staff beaming button is enabled. This is only in MuseScore 4. 3 did not have the ability to add this to the toolbar. So now I've got those notes selected. I can click the cross staff beaming button, and I get my two options for move to staff above or move to staff below. It's not smart enough to realize that there is no staff above, but there we go. Move to staff below. Now they're down there. Now the thing with the offsets is, like, let's pretend that the bottom staff is actually going to have some notes. Let me put in some quarter notes here. G, A, B, G. So you'll see that MuseScore is managing, it's avoiding the collision between that C and that B, which is good. MuseScore 4 does this. Again, MuseScore 3 was pretty limited in its engraving capabilities, in its spacings, and so forth. So this is one of the very many improvements that are in MuseScore 4 as far as this goes. But unfortunately, I do still have to flip that stem up. When I flip the stem up, it also reverses the order of the two notes, which is correct notation. You may or may not like the spacing that exists now, and so yeah, there's still some places where you might want to tweak things, but this is actually not bad. So in MuseScore 3, you would have had to do a lot more adjustment. It would not have avoided this collision here between this C and that B. When using cross-staff notation, MuseScore 3 didn't know how to avoid those collisions, but MuseScore 4 does. So MuseScore 4 has definitely made cross-staff notation less painful, but there are still some cases where you might have to do some fiddling. So it definitely is the case. So I mentioned before that it's important that when you change voices, you are in note input mode when you do it. Let's see what happens. I'm going to go to another measure here, and a common thing is people might select a measure and then say, hey, I want to enter notes into voice 2. If I click the voice 2 button right now, nothing happens. Or if I select this rest and press the voice 2 button, also nothing happens. If I had some notes already there and I select the beginning of that and press voice 2, now something happens, but it's not what I wanted. This is not what I wanted to happen. I didn't want to change that C to voice 2. I wanted to start entering voice 2 notes. So the bottom line here is if you are getting ready to enter notes, you have to go into note input mode first, then click the voice button. So if I select this measure and press N for to go to note input mode, now I click the voice 2 button. And then I can enter my notes. So when you're entering into voice 2, make sure you're already in note input mode when you press the voice button. On the other hand, being able to change the voices of existing notes, and Rachel, I do see your observation, and I'm going to come back and talk about that in a second because it does relate to this other thing, and I forgot to come back to it, but I will come back to your question, Rachel. So I have these quarter notes in voice 1, but I mean in voice 2 and in voice 1, right? And here I've got separate voices, but did I need separate voices? That's an important consideration, and let me talk about this here. Let's flip back and look at the Bach example. In the Bach example here, there are certain places where the two voices do happen to have the same rhythm, like right here. Oh, I messed with my, let me turn back on all my playbacks. There we go. So, like starting right there, there we go. So there's certain places like these eighth notes here or these eighth notes down here where both voices have the same rhythm. There might even be a passage as long as a measure where two voices have the same rhythm on the same staff. Bach wouldn't normally do that for a full measure in a fugue. I'm not saying he would never do it, but he's usually a little, here's the closest I see eighth notes here, but one of them turns into a quarter note. Oh, look here, look right here. Here's Bach's got it going, check out. The left hand is all eighth notes. And that's because this is basically what's called an episode, and then it's not as contrapuntal as other places in a fugue. That's a little music theory for you there. But so because both voices have the same rhythm, we could potentially combine them into one voice. But you would never do that in a fugue because it's really important that we understand which voice is which. In a fugue, we want to know the independent voices. We want to build a track, and here you can see by the stem directions that it's not what you think. Here, the middle voice is actually below the top voice. That's just what happens in this particular fugue due to the way the imitation is working out. The voices actually cross briefly in this passage here. So it's important to maintain the distinct voices in contrapuntal pieces like this, where if there's three voices, you want to see three voices. However, in choral music, like this one here, it is pretty common that people would say, you know what, this measure here, everyone has the same rhythm. Let's just go ahead and put them all in the same voice. Let's just go ahead and do that. I think most editors do that, but not like 99%, like maybe 70%, maybe 60%, I don't even know. Most editors probably will choose to combine voices in choral music like this where they can. Others say, you know what, let's not. And some people will say, no, it depends on the style of the music. If it's mostly the same rhythm with only a few places where it differs, then they might combine them. But if it's mostly different, like it is in this contrapuntal section here, mostly different and only combining in a few places, they probably won't combine them. So, so anyhow, you can combine voices. So what I'm going to do here is select these voice 2 notes by control clicking them or command clicking on a Mac, and now I could just click the voice 1 button and that moves them to voice 1. So this is why it is an important feature that clicking the voice button while in normal mode changes the voice of a note, because it is something you might want to do. You might want to change a note from voice 1 to voice 2 or vice versa. And so pressing the voice buttons while in normal mode will do that, which is the same way duration buttons work, right? If you think about the duration buttons, if I click a quarter note and then click the half note, it changes it to a half note. If you want to enter a half note, then you better be in note input mode. So the voice buttons work just like the duration buttons in that respect. So it's important to have that distinction in your head. Voice buttons in note input mode affect what you're about to enter. Voice buttons in normal mode affect what you have selected, just like duration. If you can keep that in your head strongly, you'll avoid the problem that Dave is talking about here, where you get confused about what's going on. That said, yeah, I'll agree that the color of the cursor is not as big of a clue as I would like. It's subtle, especially because the blue and the green don't look as different as I think they could. So I would absolutely love to see a clearer visual indication of which voice you're in when entering notes. So yeah, that definitely seems to be opportunity for some improvement. So Dave is also observing that when I move these notes into voice 1, it left behind rests, which I can now delete them. Boom, 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 right? So I can delete those rests if I want. And I would in that case. However, there's another option. Let me undo all those changes. If I select this measure and then go to Tools, Implode. Tools Implode will look for rhythms that it can combine, and it will combine them. And it will remove the rests. So for combining voices, it's a great option. And check out like what happens here in my choral piece here. I can select these two full measures here. I can go to Tools, Implode, and it combined the notes it could. See, these notes are now combined onto one staff, onto one voice. These notes here are combined into one voice, but these two beats here where they differed were not combined. So now I just undid it. So Implode is a great tool to use at the end of the process to sort of combine things. So Frank, I see your comment here, but I am going to come back. And Stephen, your comment about colors, actually I'm going to talk about that one first. There was a customization option that there was some discussion among the design team about whether to keep those options. But if you go to Edit Preferences under Advanced, here are the options to control the colors there, to customize them. So yeah, you can get the colors to be a little more distinct if you want to spend time figuring that out. You absolutely can. But now I want to come back to Rachel's question here, because it's about how whole notes are treated. So in cases where, like, let's take this note right here. In cases, let me go back to actually the way it was. In cases like this, where you have two notes in different voices, or that are like adjacent like this, MuseScore knows to kind of offset them like that. And actually, let me do that in another measure, just so I can play with this a little better. I'm going to enter voice 1, and now switch to voice 2, and enter a B. So MuseScore knows to offset those two notes so that they don't collide with each other. However, if they have the same pitch, MuseScore knows to combine their note heads. And so it knows to do that, and then you'll have one note head with two stems. But the question is, what if they're both whole notes? So I'm going to press 7 to change that to a whole note. And then I will click this note, press 7 to change it to a whole note. And now I'm going to raise this pitch of the C of the B to a C. Now I see the two whole notes side by side, offset. Well, this is basically correct, because the thing is, when these were quarter notes, when that was a quarter note and this was a quarter note, we had two stems to let us know both voices have that same C. In contrapuntal music, that could be really important to know, hey, there's two voices going on here, right? If this had been that Bach fugue, both voices coming together on that C, we would need to know that both voices have that C. So the two stems tell us that. However, when they were both whole notes, we don't get that, right? If the notes had been combined, we wouldn't have stems to tell us, hey, these are both voices here. So you wouldn't have that visual clue that these are in fact two voices. So the normal rule in notation is if there's no stems, let's go ahead and show them separately. There's also a similar rule if the note heads differ. So let me enter a half note in one voice, and then in the other voice, I'm going to enter some eighth notes. This is also kind of standard music practice where the note heads didn't get combined because they're different types of note heads. There's a half note and there's an eighth note. If this half note here had been a quarter note, MuseScore will combine them because then the stem without a beam is enough to tell you, hey, that voice has a quarter note, the bottom voice has eighth notes. But the half note can't really do that. If you tried making, it would look a little funny to do that. And yet, it is done. So let me show you how to do that. If you combine, let's find out, Rachel. Let's implode these half notes here. To be honest, I don't know what it's going to do. Yes, it will. Oh, implode. Implode absolutely better because they can be combined. Yeah, so implode will definitely combine them. But now it's only one voice. If you needed it to be two voices, that wouldn't be the right thing. But yeah, if you're in a situation where you are trying to condense down into one voice, implode is your secret weapon there. So this situation here where one note is a half note and then someone else has eighth notes is pretty common. It's especially common in accompaniment patterns. So like my left hand in voice 2 might have, say, a C. And then in the right hand, I mean not in the right hand, but also in the left hand, in voice 1, there might be do, 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 do. There we go. I didn't want to try to play an E while I'm still sustaining an E. That would have bothered me. So now we have the left hand sustaining a low C while also arpeggiating through it. This kind of accompaniment pattern is pretty common in piano music and super, super common in guitar music. I could also imagine it being true in harp music. I don't know if it's typically written that way. And Marla, if you happen to hear this and want to weigh in about whether it would be common. I think with harp, you'd be less likely to even bother notating the half notes. You would just notate the eighth notes and call it good. But I could be wrong about that. I'd be interested to know. But on guitar, it's pretty common to show the bass notes notated with the half notes or whole notes, but also show them as eighth notes. So some editors will do this. Will show the notes separately like this, but some will choose to combine them onto one stem. So you can do that in MuseScore as follows. I'm going to select that quarter note and press V to make it invisible. And now it's grayed out on screen. Let me turn off the display of invisible notes here in the Properties panel. And so you get this look here, where you see a half note, stem down, and then the stem up looks like a half note with a stem, but because it's connected to a beam, if you're a guitar player, you're used to seeing that sort of thing, and you would still say, oh, I know what that is. It's 4/8 notes. It's funny looking 4/8 notes, but it's okay. So in the world of guitar music, it's pretty common to combine things like this. It's probably a little less common in piano music, but I don't want to really say that. It might be equally common. I don't know. You get to decide if that's something you want to do. But basically, by hiding one of the note heads, it allowed them to combine. There's another trick you might want to know. It might be useful to you sometimes. Instead of hiding one, we can set it in Properties to have the same note head as the other one. So this is a solid note head. That's a hollow note head. If I go down to Properties where it says Show More, scroll down, I can override visual duration and force that solid note head to display as if it was a half note. And then that will also force them to combine. Sometimes you might like that better than hiding them because then you don't have to worry about whether it's grayed out on screen. So does implode do this? No, because if by same thing, Dave, you're talking about what I'm doing here, no, because implode is about combining into a single voice. This is still not a single voice. This is two separate voices still. I've still got a half note in one voice and an eighth in the other. So implode is never going to combine those. This is just about visually merging the note heads. So, yeah, and that question about whether this would ever occur in piano music, I know you've looked at a whole lot of piano music, and so I definitely trust your judgment, and my memory tells me that I'm more likely to see them not merged like this. But yeah, I don't know. I'm guessing some 19th century French manuscripts or something might be likely to combine them. But yeah, I don't claim to have all the answers. What I would do if I wanted to know that is I would go look at some. So like, actually, give me 1 second. All right, I have my Norton Anthology of Western Music here, which is a good general resource. Doesn't mostly have piano music, but it has enough piano music that I can just sort of flip around and see if I can find a piece of piano music that feels like it might be an opportunity for that, and then flip around and look to see if it ever happens. And you know, there's Chopin and there's, you know, Romantic era piano music here where if it was going to happen, I would expect to find it. And yeah, I just don't know. I'm not going to spend forever looking, but I will just make the point that when in doubt, consult the literature. You know, have in your possession some printed music, because it's so much faster to flip through printed music than to click one at a time on IMSLP and look at a score, wait for it to load, then realize, oh, that's not a score that's very useful to me, then back and find another score. I mean, yeah, IMSLP is a great resource, but sometimes paper scores, collections of paper scores are just amazing things. So anyhow, you know, I'm a big fan of consulting the literature to find examples of things that I'm interested in, and yeah, not finding any examples of someone doing that particular thing. So I don't know exactly. You know, I haven't found an example one way or the other. All right, so let's come back now to what Frank's pointing out here. So you're talking about choir. Oh man. Okay, so Frank, I think I'm following you. I'm gonna slow down. I'm gonna read it out loud. In some parts of a piece, there's split voicing, soprano 1 and soprano 2. Sometimes there's only a split for 1 or 2 notes. And now you want to export these scores as a single full score. So now you want to have a tutti score printed with only those 2 notes split, and then but also have parts for full soprano 1 and full soprano 2. Okay, so yeah, I'm pretty sure I'm following what you're talking about, and unfortunately it's kind of a pain. I don't have a good answer for you. So let me see if I can like make an example here so that you can see so people can see what we're talking about here. Let's say I have a place where you know, I have the soprano on a staff by itself, but there's one place where the soprano splits into 2 parts and then continues into 1. And so it's basically all the sopranos are singing the same notes, but there's one spot where they split into harmony, whether it's done with multiple voices or whether it's done with a chord, like I have here. The answer is going to be the same either way. Norton Anthology of Western Music. Yes, that is what I was looking at, John. There's a million different resources. If I was just looking for piano music, I would grab my book of Beethoven piano sonatas or Chopin preludes or, you know, the Bach preludes and fugues. But that's what I had handy that I thought would be a good option. So in any case, here we have a situation where there's two soprano parts, soprano 1 and soprano 2, but they're identical most places. They only split for 1 note. So I don't have a good answer for you. So basically, this is fine. You print it this way, but then if you also want to have the parts separate, Yeah, not a good answer. My bad answer is we're just going to add more instruments. So I'm going to come over here and I'm just going to add new parts for vocals. I'm going to add 2 more sopranos. Now that I have my 2 more sopranos, I can copy these notes onto there. And then I'm going to use Tools Explode, where if you didn't know about that, that's a real useful thing. It's the opposite of implode, but it's what it will do is also split chords. So it'll whether this is multiple voices or chords like this, it's going to split them up. And so now I have my soprano 1 and soprano 2 parts separate. Now I can go ahead and make sure I've got my parts for them. I'll open my parts, and you can see I've got my soprano 1 part with the E, and I got my soprano 2 part with the C. And then back in the score, I can take soprano 1 and hide it, and soprano 2 and hide it. That's my best answer for you. So enter it the way you want it to look in the score, and then have 2 additional staves and copy and paste into the soprano 1 and then explode. You can get what you want, but now if I ever change this, if I say, hey, you know what, I want this D to be a D sharp, say. Now I got to go to the soprano 1 part and make that same change there. And go to the soprano 2 part, make the same change there. So it works. It's not great, but it is better than nothing, right? So I've definitely had to resort to that on occasion. So yeah. So, I've done several different sessions on multiple voices, and it seems like every time I do, different issues come up, and I'm really happy for the discussion that we're getting here because people are sort of leading me into areas that I wasn't necessarily expecting to get into. There's maybe other areas that I might have covered that I didn't get to here yet, and then, I'll try to talk about a couple more things. But I do have several other sessions of Café about multiple voices, and of course, the lessons in the Mastering MuseScore 4 course, as well as the old MuseScore 3 course. So I've got a lot of videos talking about different aspects of working with voices. The thing with it is, it's one of those areas where there's the general concept of how you do things, and then there's the practical, well, why would I do this, and how am I going to solve this particular real-world problem? So Rachel's asking about other situations for exploding. Let me tell you what exploding was invented for. It wasn't invented for this, although it works for this. This was added later. I wrote the initial explode code like 10 years ago, and it was designed to handle a very specific situation. It was designed to handle ensemble music. So I'm going to go ahead and open a jazz big band score, or create a jazz big band score. And what we often do is situations like this where we have, say, our trumpet parts, and we know we want the trumpets to be voiced like so, like D. Like that's going to be the trumpet voicing we want. Not saying that that's actually a common voicing, but let's say it was. And then the next one was going to be more like this. And then the next one was going to be like this. And I'll make that a half note. I'll press Shift W to lengthen a little bit, Shift W to lengthen it more. So I've written out my 4 trumpet parts on one staff. Often we do that because then we can change their rhythms together like I just did. But then you realize, well, I wrote them on one staff, but I want to see them on 4 staves. This is what Explode was meant for. This is why I originally wrote the code for Explode over 10 years ago. And when I first wrote it, it was a plugin. It wasn't a native feature. But then I also rewrote it as a native feature, and it was designed to handle that case. So if I go to Tools, explode. It's going to take those 4 notes and explode them across the 4 trumpet staves. So that is the case it was intended for. But then people started saying, hey, this would also be useful for choral music if it could do other things too. Because also then the implode was designed to take all 4 of those and combine them back into one chord. But someone else said, hey, it would be nice if implode could create multiple voices. So now this is really common in orchestral music. You might have your, like say you've got 2 trumpets and you notate them on separate staves like this, but then and that way the parts can be separate, but then in the score you want to show them together. Well, what you can do is use implode now, tools implode, and it combines them into multiple voices. This was the thing that choral people really wanted to have happen. They wanted implode to not go straight to making chords. They wanted it to make multiple voices so they could have that ability. Then, if you want to have it be chords, you can run implode a second time, and now it will combine them into chords. So, explode will take either chords or multiple voices and expand them to multiple staves. Implode will take multiple staves, expand them into multiple voices, but will also take multiple voices and combine them into chords where possible in sort of 2 steps. So yeah, explode and implode are some really interesting facilities for working with ensemble music and allowing you to work back and forth between working on one staff or working on multiple staves. So yeah, that double implode is actually pretty cool, and I don't remember who came up with that idea, but whoever came up with it implemented it themselves, and they did a great job with it. Since then, we've fixed bugs and tweaked things further, but that works a lot. That works well. So yeah, the explode was one of my first things before I started getting involved in MuseScore development itself. I was writing plugins. I wrote an explode plugin. I wrote a couple other plugins that turned out not to be needed anymore also because they're built-in features. But the explode plugin was one that I wrote. And now what's ironic is at this point, I have more or less retired from writing actual MuseScore code. I write very little MuseScore code now. I think I've fixed like 2 bugs in the last several months maybe, but other people are dealing with that, and that's fine by me. But I have been getting back into plugins. I hadn't dealt with plugins for like 10 years, but in the last couple months I've started working with plugins more. So Graham is asking about 3 and 4, and yeah, there's basically no difference between MuseScore 3 and 4 in any of this functionality. Explode, implode, the way multiple voices work in general, everything is basically the same, other than some MuseScore 3 bugs have been fixed in MuseScore 4. So there were certain places where explode or implode would do not right things, could cause corruptions and so forth, and those are gradually being fixed. So mostly those are the same. Now, realize chord symbols, I can just tell you what it does really quick, but that's like a whole other lesson. But I would go into check out the chord symbol lesson in the course. But what it does is it just takes the notes. If I right click this and say realize chord symbols, it just takes the notes of that it was going to have played back and sticks them onto the staff, so that you can see them there. And does explode and implode and multiple voices work well with barbershop? Yeah, absolutely. So like those sorts of things that I was doing, combining, where's that choral piece? It's really common in barbershop that everyone mostly has the same rhythm, but there might be a couple places like this, and doing what I did of just running implode to let it combine everything into one voice where possible, keeping them separate where necessary. Implode does a great job for that. So I'm going to now, at this point, wrap up because I've covered a bunch of things, and there's always more to talk about, but there's also more weeks in the year. So look forward to next time. Oh, 2 things before I go. I meant to ask about this at the beginning, but I actually set this up to be a public stream so that you don't actually have to be logged in to be able to view this stream. And I'm going to paste a link into the chat. And actually, I'm just gonna do it myself and show you how this is gonna work. But it's going to be possible now to at least view streams without being logged in. So if I create an incognito thing here and go community, then live, and then MuseScore Café public, this should let me view the stream without being logged in, and then I can type my name here, and I'm going to do that, and I just want to see myself there. So this should let me view the stream without being logged in, and okay. We just heard that. So anyhow, we'll be talking more about that, but I wanted to test that. The last thing I need to test before I go away is just what happens when I refresh my screen. I want to see if it hangs up. I don't want it to, but if it does, then we'll know. Hopefully it doesn't, but I'm going to refresh my screen right now. Okay, I'm still here, but now my camera is off, funny, and my screen share is funny. So I'm just going to fix both of those things and then play the end music to take us out. And boom, and boom. And we don't even need the screen share. You can just look at me while we play out some music. Hopefully you're hearing the music and that refresh didn't... Oh, I'm soloing the drums. Yeah, look at that. I'm soloing the drums still. Oh, well. It's kind of nice. That's kind of fun. Can I stop soloing the drums? There we go. All right. So anyhow, thanks everyone for being here. Thanks for the question. Thanks for the discussion. And we'll be back with more next time. And you know, it's next week will be the third week of the month, so my expectation is I'm going to talk about a score of the month, and it's probably going to be that Rite of Spring. So if you haven't looked at that already from the notation project, if you're in the MuseScore course, you saw the notation project, hopefully, where I'm asking people to try their hand at that opening bassoon solo. Lots of interesting things to deal with in that, and I'm going to try my hand at it next week. So, again, well, tomorrow for Music Masterclass, we'll be talking more about rhythm, right? I'll be talking about different aspects of rhythm, notating rhythm, reading rhythms we'll talk more about syncopations, talk about different things. Got a couple specific things that I want to talk about in terms of like use of rhythms in Afro-Cuban music and other things if we can get around to that. And take a look at some of the people who have tried their hands at some of the transcription projects. So lots to talk about regarding rhythm tomorrow. Looking forward to it. And then next week we'll be moving on and talking about the major scale and major keys. And then we can get a lot more into sight singing and lots of other stuff. So lots of fun times ahead for the Music Masterclass. So look forward to seeing you then.